hello, welcome again. In this chapter 8 of the Philosophy of Happiness, we are talking about utilitarianism and hedonism. We have already talked about many of these things, and we have, found them again and again when we talked about the analytic philosophy of happiness in the previous session, and also in the introduction, and also in between. We again and again we found this idea of Bentham and Mill and the differences between them. So now we will briefly explore it one last time, and then we will be done with that. Now let us very briefly ask, what are the reasons for hedonism? We are, you could say, by nature subject to pleasure and pain, and the principle of utility recognizes this. Everybody wants to maximize pleasure and minimize pain. And you could say, like Bentham did, there is no further reason for utilitarianism. Pleasure is an intrinsic good. So it doesn't make any sense to ask, why do we look for pleasure? It's just the way our bodies are made. We do experience pleasure. Many animals do, perhaps most animals do. And this is essentially deep down a biological imperative that you are attracted towards particular things that are good for your body, like sugar or fat in terms of nutrition, or warmth, a safe environment to sleep in. And these things you're attracted to are good for you. They are beneficial for the continuation of your life. And this is finally what pleasure expresses, that there is something there that is good for you. And so striving after these things that are good for you is naturally beneficial to you. And the question why you should strive after them is thereby answered, that this is a kind of biological imperative. And Bentham says, nature has placed mankind under the governance of two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure. It is for them alone to point out what we ought to do, as well as to determine what we shall do. So there is no other reason for these things except that nature has made us so. Now, utility is the property in any object whereby it tends to produce benefit, advantage, pleasure, good or happiness, or to prevent the happening of mischief, pain, evil or unhappiness. And this applies to communities as well as to individuals. Utility is pleasure over pain, happiness over unhappiness, and the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest number. Now, this is utilitarianism, and utilitarianism is a moral theory. It aims to tell you how you should act. And you should act, utilitarianism says, as to maximize utility. Bentham proposed the felicific calculus, as it is called, which is a way to measure happiness. The happiness that comes from a particular pleasurable experience. And he says we can measure various things. We can measure intensity of the pleasure. Intensity means how strong it is. We can measure the duration, how long does it last. We can measure the certainty or uncertainty, the likelihood that the pleasure will take place. For example, buying a lottery ticket is less likely to give you pleasure, but if you manage to win, it will give you more pleasure. While taking the same money that you spent for the lottery ticket and immediately going to the shop and buying a chocolate cookie for it will give you less pleasure than the potential win of the lottery, but it will be certain, right? You can surely go to the shop and buy something. And so this is something that you have to consider when you consider different pleasures. How likely are you to actually get them? Then you have the remoteness in time. Sometimes we save money for the future, right? Then we have to consider this, that some pleasures come only after a long wait. We have the fruitfulness. Bentham uses another word for this, but Bentham uses many old words in difficult English, which we don't want to use as foreigners. So fruitfulness makes it pretty clear what he wants. Does this pleasure make us likely of experiencing more pleasure of the same time in the future? So here you think of an apple, eating an apple and smoking a cigarette, assuming both have the same intensity, duration, likelihood, and so on. Still, there's a difference between them, because eating an apple will keep you healthy and make you more likely to enjoy more apples in the future, while smoking will cut your life short. It will make you die earlier, assuming this is true, and then because you die earlier, you can smoke fewer cigarettes in the future, so your future life will be limited. And in this way, smoking a cigarette is less fruitful in terms of happiness than eating an apple, although both might have the same intensity and duration at the present moment. Finally, we have a similar element called the purity, is a factor that measures how often you can repeat a pleasure without it becoming displeasurable. So let's say a coffee, right, like that. I can drink 1 cup in the morning, and my first cup is very pleasurable, but then when I drink a second cup, it's less pleasurable, and a third is almost displeasurable, and the fourth is really painful, and the fifth, will kill me perhaps. So you have these pleasures that are not equally pleasurable when repeated, but they become, less and less pleasurable. At some point they become painful, while for other pleasures the mechanism works differently. So for example, enjoying a piece of music will not make it less likely that you enjoy a second piece of music, or a third, or a fourth, or a fifth. These, even after 50 pieces of music, you will probably have wasted a lot of time, but you will not feel like the 50th piece of music is painful in the same way like a 50th cup of coffee would be painful. So here we have a different mechanism, and Bentham calls this the purity. So he would say listening to music is more pure than drinking coffee because you can repeat the pleasure more often. And finally, we have the extent, the question how many people are affected. And some pleasures, let's say I listen to the piece of music loudly on my speakers and everybody loves this music, has a greater extent, this pleasure, because it affects other people who are also happy to listen to my music, while when I hear it in my headphones, then it's only for me, and so then you have a smaller extent because only one person is affected.